The glossy, lacquered floors of Solace Academy glared up at me like they knew everything. Every lie stitched into the seams of my uniform, every calculated step I took today, every unspoken truth caught between my ribs. I hated how bright it was here, how pristine and polished everything had to be. The light vaulted through impossibly high windows, slicing across endless marble corridors and mirrored surfaces until it cornered me, leaving no shadow deep enough to hide in. Typical alpha hubris. Even their architecture screamed, "We are untouchable." But I wasn't so sure about that. Untouchable or not, every empire had cracks buried somewhere under its facade. I'd find them. I shifted the strap of my bag higher on my shoulder, keeping my head low as I navigated the labyrinth of privilege and power. The gold crest stitched onto my blazer felt heavier than it should, like it was branding me with every step I took. But the worst part wasn't the weight of the crest, or the harsh glances slicing across my skin from towering figures in impeccable uniforms. It wasn't even the suffocating smell of burnt cinnamon layered beneath the variegated scents rising off 100 alpha pheromones, not sharp enough to sting, but persistent enough to electrify the air with the quiet hum of dominance. The worst part was that I hadn't been noticed. Not really. Not yet. Maybe it was my posture, too practiced in submission over the years, or maybe it was my silence. The way I hadn't spoken a word since I entered this place and didn't plan to unless absolutely necessary. Everything about me screamed inconspicuous, neutral even. Being invisible was supposed to be my strategy. Blend in, don't attract attention, stay alive. Easy? You'd think so. But every second their eyes slid past me felt like a betrayal, as if my entire existence was becoming irrelevant, which was dangerous. I needed to be seen, just on my own terms. Reaching the classroom felt like a victory. Victory was a brash word, but my pulse throttled inside my veins regardless, a rough staccato of relief that carried me across the threshold. The door sprang shut behind me, swallowing the world for a fraction of time. A breath escaped me, the first I'd allowed in hours. The room was spare, with window panes latticed high overhead, casting fractured light onto desks forged from some heavy, dark wood. Other students loitered in vague patterns, voices a low murmur that echoed faintly off the walls. Alpha voices. Rich and deep, with undercurrents of laughter, the kind of laughter that made me flinch, still too ready to decipher cruelty in its sharp edges. I forced my steps into rhythm and chose a desk toward the back without hesitation, anchoring myself into its worn edges like I belonged here. It was technically true, or at least it was true on paper, as long as no one looked too closely. As long as the medical records didn't leak, as long as the suppression tech hidden underneath my cuff stayed functional. There was an unspoken art to wearing masks, wasn't there? Like camouflage, but at its most intimate level. Something that pressed against your skin as you walked, contracting with invisible edges until it became an extension of yourself. You wore it until you forgot it was there at all, until someone pierced it. Someone's in my seat. The voice cut through the murmurs, low and steady but purposeful in every syllable. I blinked upward, past the folds of my own thoughts, and met eyes distinctly unlike the rest. The kind of gray you forget exists in nature. Not silver, not slate, but something muted, soft like ash caught under twilight, and cold like the last ember of a fire. I didn't answer right away, mostly because I'd been rehearsing answers all morning, planning deliberately vague responses to predictable questions, and none of them accounted for this. For gray eyes trained sharp on me with uncanny focus, paired with the kind of face you didn't forget, bone structure carved by certainty, brows tilted just slightly towards impatience. Were alpha features supposed to be beautiful or brutal? I'd never decided. Here, it was both. "You can sit somewhere else," I said finally, voice even but quieter than I meant it to be. His jaw tilted just slightly, a shadow of surprise flickering across his otherwise impassive face. Maybe no one ever told him no. Maybe answering it all had been a mistake. "That's not an answer." My grip tightened over the edge of the desk, knuckles brushing against the varnish. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of him, of the weight in his tone. There was something peculiar about it, steady and deliberate, like a bell ringing too low to pulse clearly, its vibrations planted deep beneath the surface of audible sound. Smooth. Dangerous. I spoke again, slower this time. I didn't realize there were assigned seats. The corner of his mouth shifted, but not enough to qualify as a smile. Not nearly. His gaze dragged over me once more, calculated, but strangely restrained. "Some seats aren't assigned," he said, "but they're earned." The tension was louder than the collective hum of voices filling the room, louder than each new student slipping in through the doorframe behind him. It struck against that invisible drum poised somewhere above my chest, pressing too tight against the skin. I could tell he was waiting for me to move, not because he wanted me gone, but because it would confirm some silent truth about me, something about submission, something about weakness. I lifted my chin. Looks unoccupied now. When he did smile, finally, just a fraction, it wasn't enough to thaw the frost of his eyes. But there was something sharper to it, something too amused, something that crawled up the back of my neck and took residence there. "Is that what it looks like to you?" I nodded once, stayed quiet. What was unsettling wasn't just his presence. It wasn't that his silence stretched longer than the others in the room, or that his scent didn't match the cinnamon-clad sparks scalding the others into static dominance. His was subtle, clean almost, hovering faintly like cedar smoke vanishing into autumn air. What was unsettling was how unmoved he felt. Alphas weren't supposed to be this still. Their movements were deliberate, assertive, but never quiet. Instead, they radiated, pushing their energy outward and forcing the world to bend in their presence. Gray eyes lacked the world-ending arrogance I expected. Instead, there was a peculiar weight behind them, like anything I said, anything I did, would be cataloged somewhere deep in his mind to reveal later. When he turned and walked away, I should have felt relief, should have eased the grip on my desk and resettled my shoulders, sitting perfectly upright like the trained Omega I pretended not to be. Instead, I watched his retreating figure vanish calmly into another corner of the room, his steps collected, unhurried. Beneath the steady cadence of conversation now growing louder, I swore I could still feel him. The first thing I noticed was the sound. It wasn't loud, a pen rolling lazily off the edge of someone's desk, the low thud of its landing muted by the thick carpet. But in a room like this, where even the atmosphere felt tense enough to snap, it might as well have been a firecracker. I didn't see who dropped it. All I knew was that 20 heads stayed bowed, 20 gazes fixed firmly on their work. No one turned. No one shifted. Just the faintest ripple of acknowledgement filtered through the room like an undercurrent. And then stillness cloaked them all again, as if daring the air not to resume its silence. But not him. He looked up. Of course he did. An alpha like that could have snapped the thread of quiet with a glance alone, pulled it taut and watched it unravel just to see how far it would go. God, he didn't even move at first, just tilted his head ever so slightly, gray eyes flicking toward the sound as if it mattered, as if whoever dropped the pen deserved even the tiniest bit of his attention. The motion stretched out like a drawn breath, deliberate in a different kind of way, less command, more curiosity, an almost human crack in the glacial facade he wore so well. I was staring. I knew I was.
The kind of staring you do when you're positive you're invisible, but part of you, the primal, animal part, knows better. And how could I not? He wasn't doing anything, and yet every inch of him demanded acknowledgement. The sharp angles of his face looked painted in by low, slanting afternoon light. That quiet tension in the line of his jaw, the faint shadow of trouble hidden where it should have been strength.
He didn't look like he belonged here, and somehow he owned every inch of the space anyway. I forced my eyes away, staring down at the page in front of me, as if memorizing the bland scrawl of my own notes might erase the image. But even as my pen scratched useless circles in the corner of the paper, I knew better. His presence clung to the air like the faint, static buzz of an old television screen. It didn't matter if I never looked up again. I'd still feel him. And that might have been the end of it, for now, if not for the scrape of his chair legs against the floor. That sound cut through the tension like the first cracks in ice about to give way below your feet. It wasn't alarming, not really, but it was enough to send the smallest flicker of apprehension skittering down my spine. Movement, I told myself. That's all. A perfectly logical thing for him to do. Breathe. Still, I watched from the corner of my eye as long legs carried him across the room, each step deliberate but quiet, as if he'd somehow found a way to move in rhythm with the ambient hum of this place. He wasn't coming for me, thank God, but something about the shift in the room had the same heavy, off-balance feel as the ocean tilting beneath your feet on an unfamiliar boat. I didn't risk watching him too closely again, couldn't really, but the sound of his steps alone made it impossible not to imagine. Decisive, unhurried. When he stopped, it wasn't at the front of the room where most people did such things. Instead, he turned to the closest beta seated nearby, Martin, or maybe Marcus, someone so unmemorable I'd failed to file him away properly, and extended one long-fingered hand. "Your pen," he said simply, the words a low murmur that still somehow had the focus of a laser. His tone wasn't cold, but that didn't mean it wasn't unnervingly calm. Controlled. A vacuum of emotion so precise it rolled down my nerves in icy spirals. The beta stammered something soft about gratitude, wide-eyed and pink-eared like an intern who'd just been congratulated by a CEO. The pen exchanged hands with almost excruciating reverence, and just like that, my alpha, and no, I absolutely didn't mean it like that, turned back the way he came, as steady and inscrutable as a pendulum swing. He couldn't have produced a bigger scene if he'd flipped a table, and yet every single person in that room had felt the ripple he left behind. I felt it most of all when he returned to his seat directly across from me. On the surface, it wouldn't have mattered. Rows divided us like trenches dug into hostile soil, and there were heads between us, barriers of hair and postures too stiff to penetrate. But spaces like this didn't leave much room for imagination, and proximity had its way of making itself known. He worked in slow, efficient gestures, always with an irritating smoothness that said, "I don't have to try at this, and we both know it." There was something mechanical about the way his hands moved, flipping through pages as though he already knew what lay ahead. He didn't look at me, not really, but I knew he knew I was there. There was no way he didn't. That buzz again, hovering on the edge of sensation. Like when he looked was an inevitability, not a choice. And sure enough, it came. Sudden enough to catch me off guard, though I couldn't have said why. The tilt of his head shifted, just slightly, and then those gray eyes found mine. They weren't hot or smoldering. People like him didn't deal in cliches. They were a little too sharp for their own good, like the edge of a blade where you couldn't decide if it was elegant or just dangerous. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like anything, really. And yet, there it was again, that subtle tightening of my stomach, that quiet warning. I'd been dissecting this moment even before it happened,
And still, I was caught sharp between calculated disinterest and the sort of visceral instinct that said, run. Instead of running, I tilted my chin up, a hair barely noticeable. My mind spun through an endless roulette of tactical responses. Keep it casual, arrogance, polished indifference, calm, calculated to the point of cruelty. This is nothing. You're nothing. Years of practice cloaked me like armor. Omegas learned quickly that if they couldn't be stronger, they'd settle for untouchable. But the problem with untouchable was that you had to mean it. And the problem with him? He didn't flinch. Those sharp, heavy eyes stayed fixed, cataloging, weighing options. It wasn't fearsome the way I'd been trained to expect. It was richer, somehow, older, like he was bored of peeling away secrets people didn't know they were giving him, but still did it anyway. And still, silent tension only spoke so far. He blinked, slow and deliberate, as if dismissing whatever theories he'd been constructing and replacing them with something entirely new. You flinch when you're wound too tight, he said finally, as if offering up the answer to a problem neither of us had posed. You're going to stick out. The words settled low in my chest, acidic and sharp. God, I hate that he's right. And you're a bit of a condescending asshole, I replied, though there was too much air in my voice, biting when it should have been razor clean. Every syllable a restrained effort not to lean harder into his provocation. For the first time, the edge of his mouth quirked, though whether it was contempt or genuine amusement, I couldn't tell. I hated him for it either way. It's messy, he answered, cool, assured. His chair leaned infinitesimally forward, just enough to close the improbable gaps lingering between us. I know something about messy. You don't know anything about me, I muttered, distant, dismissive. But the way he reclined in response, so faintly pleased with himself, left me gnawing on his answer for the rest of the day. More dangerous still was the part of me starting to hope, absurdly, that one day he would. The evening skies spilled across the academy courtyard in hues of lavender and amber, casting playful shadows beneath the grand ivy-covered archways. The air hung with the scent of autumn leaves, crisp and comforting like a well-worn sweater. But despite the tranquil setting, a storm was brewing inside the mind of one particularly detached alpha. His gaze flickered toward the gathering of students, seeking out a familiar silhouette among them. I recognized that silhouette, my new companion, Ben, a beta whose warmth was like a sunbeam breaking through a cloudy day. We stood close enough to the main path of the academy grounds that our chatter could easily be overheard by those passing by. Ben had a knack for finding the silver lining in things endearingly pessimistic. With laughter as clear and vibrant as the bells that rang between classes, he managed to coax a smile from me despite the rigid mask I struggled to maintain. You know, I heard once that flamingos are only pink because of what they eat, Ben said, casually brushing fallen leaves from the stone bench beside him. Imagine what we'd look like if our diets determined our colors. I chuckled, the sound nearly foreign to me after months of emotional exile. I'd probably be some dull shade of oatmeal then, I replied, earning a ribbing shoulder nudge from him. Before he could respond with another clever quip, a presence interrupted, one that had haunted my peripheral gaze since that first encounter. The alpha, Alex, emerged from the lingering shadows with an impassive expression, yet his stance betrayed his disquiet. Tension irradiated from him like static before a summer storm, and I could sense the earth shift beneath the precarious balance we unofficially held. "Enjoying your grand epiphanies?" Alex asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to coil around the moment, a serpent, testing its reality by touch. "Better than some," Ben retorted, his playful demeanor unfazed. The silence that followed was not oppressive, but it swirled around us like a reality both denied and acknowledged. I felt the shift, as if an inner tilt had been acknowledged between Alex and me, a game only one of us seemed to understand. It was then, with the side of my vision, I caught the telling flicker of Alex's gaze, lingering a moment too long on my companion. And just like that, his mask cracked, letting slip a glimpse of the depth beneath. Jealousy, a potent and bewildering sensation, tightening around a heart he claimed was stone. The realization nodded at me with familiarity, a part of his puzzle I hadn't dared to venture into until now. This was my flaw, forever seeking the difference in nuance, the potential for conflict, even if it sprang from nothing more than human insecurities. Here, within his gaze, I sensed more than just a competitor's curiosity. There was something wild and possessive, slipping through the cracks and mirroring the very emotion I had tried so hard to conceal myself. "You seem awfully interested in my choices lately," I noted, daring my voice to remain steady before his piercing regard. "It's almost inspiring." Alex's jaw tightened, a forceful restraint against words yet unspoken. And in that pause, I felt, for the first time, the precarious weight of a solitude he held at bay. "He's not one of us," Alex replied, his voice softer, almost vulnerable in its confrontation. "He makes me laugh," I said. Simple words, but they landed heavily, like a whispered confession, echoing in the silent spaces time created for us. "That's controversial," Alex retorted, a shadow of amusement slipping into his voice. I dared not explore what lurked beneath that surface, but there it was, an unusual path of understanding beginning, despite the conspiracies of our differences and the rules that sought to harness them. I could see this being our essence, a shared reality tinted with color and purged of disguise. But Ben, whose presence symbolized ease I craved yet felt undeserved, saw the moment unravel and filled the silence with gentle laughter, both guiding me away from the precipice and securing the truth of this invisible confrontation. With a look that exchanged neither favor nor rivalry, he met Alex's resolve and broke through its brittle armor, even if only temporarily. And though Ben rose to leave, speaking of assignments and restless minds, Alex stayed, anchored by a compulsion yet to settle in his chest. Just before he turned away, his expression softened in a departure from the coldness it usually displayed. Standing there under the moon's gauzy light, I saw for the first time the fragile humanity Alex hid beneath his practiced facade. We were hidden parts of a conspiracy neither of us had dared unmapped. In that moment, I dared hope that promise, one where we could break free from the identities assailed upon us and see each other anew. As Alex retreated back into the gentle anonymity of the night, leaving only the somber echo of footsteps on cobblestone paths, I found myself contemplating a question touched with trepidation. Was this forerunner helmet fated to become the nurturing harbor of connections instead of confrontation? And there, amid drifting shadows bathed in moonlight's tender embrace, we both became conspirators in end, to dance not between rival walls, but new realities with the courage found partially unmasked. The air was heavy, thick, with the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but brimming. It was the silence before thunder, coiling and sparking, crawling against the edges of my skin. I stood there, weight shifting on the narrow stone ledge beneath the lamplit corridor, with my back pressed against the cool, unyielding wall. The night pressed close, the quiet only punctuated by the faint metallic hum of the Academy's outdoor lights. They flickered, once, briefly, casting his shadow longer than it had any right to be. "Alex?" He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't need to. The tension in his chest was carved into the way his arms hung rigid at his sides, the way his jaw set unevenly, each muscle tightening like a noose being pulled. I hadn't seen him coming. I'd hoped tonight.
The one maddening night in a week shaped entirely by glances that felt like licks of fire. He'd simply leave me be, but he hadn't. And there he was, lighting the air with the controlled, dangerous force of someone who was just beginning to realize the depth of his own fracture. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was low, barely audible, as if forcing the words out before himself was the real confrontation. I flinched, though he hadn't moved toward me. The sharp syllables weren't loud, not really, but they cracked through the night like an edge on glass, an accusation both bitter and disbelieving. I couldn't meet his eyes yet, couldn't risk what would be there. Revulsion, maybe? Or worse, pity. My hands curled into fists at my sides, the nails biting dully into my palms as I folded in slightly on myself. The word tasted foreign. My breath caught painfully in my throat, and I hurried to swallow it down, choking on what wouldn't form. "I didn't tell you because—" A faint laugh slipped out, entirely humorless, trembling as it fell apart in my chest. The words billowed weakly, dissipating, offering nothing. Across the stone walkway, he stepped closer. Too fluidly. It wasn't the motion of someone advancing to attack, but it still cornered me all the same, forced me to look up. When I did, I wasn't sure what I hated more, that I was afraid, or that his expression reflected it back at me. "You didn't think I'd find out? That no one else would?" His tone was quiet, mutinous, but his anger wasn't held cleanly. It shifted, wavered, betrayed him with how close it sat to something else. The edges of his words softened, just slightly, as if tugged downward by an ache he hadn't anticipated. It would have been less terrifying if he'd simply yelled. "You don't understand." My voice was barely there, a thread against the dark, and I wanted to pull it back even as I spoke. "Don't I? Is that the story here?" he shot back instantly. But the bitterness faltered almost as soon as it rose to his lips. Alex's chest tightened visibly, his breathing shallow and fast, fingers twitching like they wanted to grab at something they knew they couldn't hold. The mask he lived behind, so carefully constructed, all sharp planes and cold composure, slipped enough now for me to glimpse the raw, furious vulnerability beneath. My secret, the one stitched so carefully within layers of practiced neutrality, dangled between us, a pendulum that swung closer with every word. I had tried so hard to be invisible here, and yet here I was, momentarily visible in the kind of uncompromising way that takes and destroys. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," I said, almost frantically, the tremor leaking through. It was true, but that truth felt insignificant in the face of whatever his expression had become. "You weren't? What? Trying to?" He cut himself off, dragging a hand suddenly along his temple, knuckles whitening with the force. For the first time since I met him, Alex honestly, genuinely didn't know where to aim the sharpness inside himself. I hated that I was the one standing here watching him unravel layer by layer. When he finally spoke again, his voice lacked its usual striking precision. It folded in on itself as he asked the question I never wanted him to voice aloud. "Do you think everyone else here deserved to know something I didn't?" "No," I rasped, the sound breaking open in a way I hadn't allowed all these months. My face burned, though the night was cool and still and unrelenting. I shook my head fiercely, but the motion made my vision blur worse. It was never about you." My gaze dropped to the stones between us as my shoulders pulled inward. There wasn't much distance left, but suddenly that narrow strip felt as vast as everything I'd spent so long trying to outrun. "It feels like it is," he murmured. Something in his voice cracked there, its edge dull with wear. I didn't want to ask what exactly he meant, didn't want to hear the weight of his realizations fall alongside mine. But instead of dismantling me the way I'd imagined, his movements shifted. They softened like an unspoken apology.
A resigned exhale as he leaned his frame back against the side rail. His shoulders dropped minutely, turning abruptly human under the streetlight's overly dramatic glow. When I dared glance up this time, his dark gaze wasn't fixed on me like a lock he expected to break. It was softer, half cast toward the ground in a kind of disbelief I almost couldn't touch. His hand brushed briefly through his unkempt hair. It lingered there before he dragged it away again. "I don't care who you are," he whispered sharply, finally pulling himself apart with that statement. His jaw clenched with the honesty, as though the words burned on their way out. And that was when the tears came. Right there, without my permission or warning, they started and wouldn't stop, hot trails streaking desperately. Each drop was just as much failure as it was exhaustion, a floodgate finally bowing beneath some fragile inner weight. I thought I'd bitten it down, swallowed it all for good. But seeing him like that, saying things like that, broke what I clung in secret to. "I care," I choked, vision warping Alex into something indistinct. "I care because I can't. If you knew what I was, what I am, you'd understand why it all has to stay." I couldn't finish. I broke entirely. My knees buckled forward, and I braced my arms against the railing to keep upright. My chest was heaving too much to suck air properly, vision spinning. I heard him step forward. Too quiet, or was I simply lost already? Hesitating, but just enough to miss my collapse. A pause, more instinct than choice, until his breath met mine, a short, sharp exhale. His palm brushed faintly against my elbow, scared to settle fully, but unwilling to step back. I hated this moment. I hated it because I cracked, letting someone near the fractures I'd carted for so long. It felt unforgivable. And yet, while his touch lingered there, a tether I wasn't ready to test, I wasn't sure what exactly would undo us next. For the first time, there was no rivalry, no facade to navigate. It was just us, both of our walls softening in an unwelcome, unbearable intimacy. "Stop hiding," he murmured. It wasn't an order or a demand. It wasn't even a plea. Just 4 words that threatened to press the last fragile truth from my heart. Not from me. The air was heavy with the weight of everything I hadn't said. Above us, the sky stretched wide and infinite, scattered with stars that didn't so much twinkle as pulse faintly, like they were trying to draw breath. It was the kind of night that invited stillness, the kind that dared you to speak and break something sacred. Even the wind had stilled, content to be a quiet observer, leaving behind only the faint scent of grass and the cool bite of autumn curling at the edges of my sleeves. He was still standing too close, closer than anyone had stood in a long time. His silhouette was sharp against the silvered light, shoulders tense, hands buried in his jacket pockets, as if to keep himself from doing something reckless, or maybe something brave. I couldn't decide which unnerved me more. "Say something." His voice, low and measured as always, carried an edge tonight. Like maybe he was holding his breath too? But there was something else threaded in the sound, something fragile, aching, something that didn't belong on him. I tried to look anywhere but at him. Staring straight ahead, I fixated on the half-dead lamppost a few yards away, its yellow glow fighting a losing battle against the night. My hands fumbled with the hem of my sweatshirt, pressing wrinkles into fabric that already suffered enough. "What do you want me to say?" "That you meant it." The words hit me squarely in the chest, but when I turned to face him, because of course I turned, it wasn't anger I saw in his eyes, not the scalding heat of our usual standoffs, not the cold amusement that cut sharper than any blade. The look he gave me was steady, raw, and terrifying in its sincerity. Confessing feelings was not supposed to look like this. Not from him. He was supposed to be a storm, relentless and volatile. He wasn't supposed to be standing there so still, so open, like he'd left a door ajar and didn't care what shattered upon entry. "I think you have the wrong idea," I managed, except my voice splintered halfway through. I wasn't even convincing myself. Keep lying, I told myself. Keep stumbling over some threadbare version of control before this unravels into something beyond repair. But the walls I had so carefully patched together didn't even feel like walls anymore. They felt like paper, damp paper. And as if he could sense my hesitation, he took a step forward. God, just one single step, and it was enough to make my heartbeat shift into something inconsistent. Some crueler part of me almost wished he would give me that trademark smirk, reset the unbalanced scale back to something manageable. If he just teased me, annoyed me, I could cope. I could fall back into the safety of our old rhythm, the rough-kneed rivalry that kept us both sharp. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, waiting. His gaze was too much and not enough. It pressed everywhere, quietly dismantling things beneath the surface. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded in the night. You shouldn't care." The word was quick and sharp, a knife against flint, but the fire didn't last. It softened just as fast into something quieter, smoky. He tipped his head faintly to the side, studying me like I'd become a question without an answer. "You think I care in spite of you? That's what you're building this into, isn't it? This whole artificial distance? Some excuse to pretend none of this is real." I couldn't stop my lips from twitching into a bitter half-smile. "That's a little presumptuous of you." "No," he said, deadpan. "It's just true." And then he dropped his eyes, just for a moment, but long enough that I could see the crack in the armor he swore he didn't wear. "I don't care about the secret. You know that, don't you?" The way he lowered his voice when he said it, that tiny, devastatingly human inflection, was like being hit by a freight train I couldn't even see. Or maybe I could see it coming the whole time, and that was worse, knowing it was on its way and still being too paralyzed to run. "You don't understand." The words felt clumsy, brittle in my mouth. My fists clenched at my sides, not in anger, but to keep my hands from trembling. "You can't just say that like it's simple. It's not. None of this is. And if you make it simple, that's how someone gets hurt." He shook his head faintly, and for a second, the soft laugh that fell from his lips wasn't cold, sharp, or mocking. It was resigned in a way I couldn't stand. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think it hasn't ripped me apart every time I see you trying so hard not to exist? I know how this ends. I know the risk of trying to hold you when you'll do whatever it takes to pull away." "Then why?" "Because it's you." He cut me off, the words falling ragged, unfinished. His hands were out of his pockets now, ghosting faintly in the air like they might reach for me. "Because maybe I'm an idiot, or maybe I've just been lying to myself for too long about what was supposed to come out of this, whatever this rivalry was." He looked up sharply, meeting my gaze in a way that felt dangerous. "But I don't care about what you're hiding." My throat tightened. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not," he answered. Simple, quiet, unapologetic. And then, "What do you want me to say then? That I haven't thought about this, about you, for longer than I want to admit? That maybe it doesn't even make sense to me either, but it's there, and it's too loud to pretend it isn't?" There was the moment, that final step taken, and no way left to retreat without undoing everything in its wake. The words hung heavy between us, amplifying the ache that swelled in my chest. I dropped my gaze, shaking my head faintly. My voice was barely audible when I spoke. "You make everything so damn complicated." "You're the one making it complicated," he countered.
But the way he smiled, small, tired, sad, took the heat from his words. You keep hiding like it's a favor to some inevitable disaster, like running away is going to hurt less than staying. I swallowed hard against the lump rising in my throat. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong, and that terrified me more than anything else. My whole life, I'd built something out of this, a shield, a proxy version of myself constructed so carefully, I wasn't even sure I remembered what was under it. To let him see the cracks, let alone step through them, felt less like vulnerability and more like an ending. But his voice was softer when he spoke again. Like he didn't expect permission, but wanted it anyway. For once, just let someone see you. When I finally dared lift my gaze to his again, I felt something shift, not in him, but in me. Something warmer than fear, something dangerous, something I didn't know how to name just yet. But it left part of me wondering, just maybe, if it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to stop running. The stars pulsed faintly overhead. I let the silence hold that possibility for us both. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the void that accompanies stillness, but a quiet that felt deliberate, built with the intention of being heard. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but it left everything sodden beneath a layer of silvered dampness, as though the earth had been sealed with wax. The stars, heavy with their duty to watch, had drifted away with the storm, and the world, now cooled and faintly humming, had given itself back to the early cracks of dawn without asking permission. He stood there just a few feet from me, almost still, except for the slow drag of his breath. Even that wasn't loud enough to break what held us in place, like something alive and tangible had stretched out between us the moment he stepped closer. I don't think a lot of people would survive this world without someone, he said, suddenly. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't trying to be profound or even comforting, more like it was a fact he'd learned the hard way and carried with him ever since. A fact so simple it hurt to hear it. I forced my eyes down to my feet instead of letting them linger on him. My shoes were specked with mud, still damp from everything I'd stumbled through earlier. That should have been my only focus, the details of things small enough to count, safe enough to parse. But trying to fold the moment into pieces felt like trying to pocket the sea. He took another step closer. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he said, softly, voice steady, even as his hands flexed and fisted by his sides. Then, quieter, trying and failing to disguise how raw his words had become. "You don't have to hide everything you are." My breath tangled in my throat, caught like someone else had grabbed hold of it without warning. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say something sharp and unkind, something that would push him away, turn this moment into smoke that couldn't be rebuilt. But my chest ached in places I didn't know existed, and nothing came out. He watched me like I was something dangerous he wasn't afraid of and didn't want to lose. That look, it was wide and steady and unapologetically alive, like all his walls had been stripped down by time, piece by piece, and he was letting me see what had survived when it shouldn't have. Nobody had ever looked at me like that before. "What if I don't know how to stop pretending?" I asked before I could stop myself. I hated how my voice trembled, like the question wasn't a challenge, but an admission of something I couldn't fix. His expression didn't shift, not the way I thought it might. "Then let me show you," he said. Simple, immediate, like it wasn't a suggestion but a promise. The way he said it made something sharp twist beneath my ribs. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything at all. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and waited for him to tell me this wasn't real, or that it wasn't what I thought,
or that I was somehow wrong about him, still being here. But he didn't. His shoulders relaxed slightly, allowing some tension to drain from his frame as he tilted his head toward me. The movement was just enough to catch the faint morning light, soft and blue and cold across his features. He had this strange mix of concentration and hesitation carved into the line of his brow, like even now he was calculating the distance between us and deciding how far was too far. For a single, unbearable moment, I thought he might reach out, might place his hand somewhere along the curve of my shoulder or my wrist, not to take something, but to give, to offer anything he thought I could carry. He didn't.
Instead, he glanced down before shaking his head slightly, almost like he was laughing at himself. It wasn't real laughter, though, just something small and self-aware, stripped of smugness, but full of restraint. "You're unbelievable sometimes," he murmured, not harsh, not frustrated, just quiet, more to himself than to me. He looked back at me, then swallowed hard, like his words were enough to leave him exposed. That subtle shift, that weighted silence, left room for something new to settle between us. Not tension, but understanding. The moment where two people recognize, without saying it, that their survival might depend on having each other. And neither one of us knew how to name that yet. I don't know why, but I spoke again. Maybe because he was still here, still close enough to feel something warm, radiating off his presence, but just far enough that I couldn't make sense of it. Or maybe because quiet was the only place I'd ever found courage before. "I wouldn't have lasted a day here without you," I admitted, softer than I intended, all edges stripped away. Saying it almost felt like letting something leave me that shouldn't have. His expression didn't change right away, but the tighter line of his jaw slackened slightly. There was a flicker of something else, too, like surprise, or relief, or even gratitude, although I couldn't be sure. "You don't have to give me credit," he replied, voice steadier now, but still low, still careful. "We both know you're stronger than you let yourself believe." I felt my throat tighten again, the words sticking against every hollow and hurt inside me. But I nodded, because even if I didn't believe that, maybe, just maybe, I could borrow his faith long enough to make it my own. He let silence hold us for a beat longer before his lips turned up faintly, a real smile, slight but undeniable. "I meant what I said," he continued. "You don't have to go through this place alone." And just like that, it hit me. All the moments before, the tension, the confrontation, the uncertainties swirling up through the chaos of everything we couldn't say, they had been leading me here. Not a betrayal, not a loss, but a choice. The kind you make knowing damn well you'll never get a second chance. The morning's light spilled further across the horizon, folding us into the beginnings of something unfamiliar, but unafraid. Neither a conclusion, nor a start, but simply what comes after. I let my hands relax by my sides. For once, I didn't look away.